simple. And the sons of men were wicked. And look at how the world got. Do we know this? The Bible only indicates there was one man that was righteous with God? Now, some people say, well, his 3 sons. And then, well, the Bible never says they were righteous. But it says Noah was. And because of that, in Genesis 6, right about verse 8, it says Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. If you stick to what God wants you to do, God's going to stand behind you. You marry the right person, God's going to stand behind that marriage. But generally, if you start intermingling and marrying the wrong people, you're going to wind up in trouble. And I mean big trouble. Remember the one they call the wisest man to ever live? I understand the Bible teaches that. But my physical human brain, I'm having a hard time figuring out how he was wise. Now, I've had trouble over the last 46 years, come December, of handling one woman. He married how many? 700? And that wasn't enough. He had to have 200 on the side? Or was it 300? Pardon me? 300 on the side. That's 1,000 women he's got to be concerned about. How in the world is that wise? But you know, all kidding aside, here's why I really have a problem digesting in my mind of him being wise. The wisest man in the world, right? And his wives took him into idolatry, and he died as an idolater. I don't see the wisdom. The one thing I've always tried to do is make sure, no matter what happens in our life here in this world, the church comes first. And that's why I got my little 8-month-old grandson here and don't really know what to do about him. It was nice coming down the freeway and he's nice and quiet back there. Startled him a couple times because he's playing with this thing, and if he hits the button right, it says, "I'm a cow, moo, moo, moo." And that was a little disconcerting, but Rose put a bunch of stuff in his spare parts bag, and I don't even know what half of them are. But he can learn to go to church too. 8 months is not too young. Every one of our children, the first Sunday they were home, they were in worship services. But Solomon let him turn him into idolatry. Now let's look at this since she brought it up, because if I don't say it, it's going to bother me all week, okay? Yes, you're not supposed to marry anyone but a certain qualified people. And I'll give you some of the qualifications real quick. It has to be somebody that is available for marriage. Now let me explain what I mean. There's people running around out there, even some in the church, probably some in this congregation, that are not available for marriage. And I'll give you a good example why. A man marries this sweet young lady. He goes a few years and he decides there's another sweet young lady over there and I'm going to trade the old one in for a new one. So he gets divorced. And then down the road, he gets baptized. Now, some people think that solves everything. I don't. Because the Bible teaches, if it teaches anything, that when they were married, and this is Christ's words, they became one. And Christ says in Matthew 19:9 that a man that divorces his wife, save for the cause of fornication, and marries another, committeth adultery. So that's not justified marriage. And I've heard people say the innocent party, but you're going to have to visualize this. Jesus also said in Matthew 5 and verse 32, whosoever marries her commits adultery, and therefore she's committing adultery too, because adultery is a two-person act. So that's number one. In the state of Arizona, as well as in California, and I imagine other states, but I've done most of my career work in Arizona and California, you have to meet a certain qualification of age to be married. So it has to be available for marriage. Then you need to look at what kind of person is that? Whether he's a Christian or not, if he likes to go out and drink and get his little cart and smoke that local weed, which scares me to death, he's not a good candidate for marriage. Now, just a second, sister. Now let's go to that other verse. It's better to marry than to burn. One of the problems the world has, and I found out in 56 years of preaching, members of the church have, is playing scriptures against each other. You cannot walk with God and serve mammon at the same time. Jesus says that. Therefore, you can't look at, here's what this scripture says. Therefore, I'm going to get by it with this one. Now, let me tell you what my problem is trying to use it's better to marry than to burn. They're trying to legalize lust. Because they got such a sexual lust for that person that they figure they're going to play games with God and I'm going to marry him. Be very careful. And I don't know if you guys are going to like me saying this or not, but the sexual act plays a very minor part in a lifetime marriage. It really does. And if that marriage is based entirely on the sexual act, it's not going to be very many years before that marriage has nothing to be based on. It can't be done. Don't try to say, you need to pick the right spouse, but it's better to marry than to burn, because in 90% of the cases, you pick the wrong spouse and you could end up burning. You can end up very unhappy for your life, and that may push you into doing something dumb. Now, I was taught at a very early part of our marriage that divorce was not acceptable. I noticed, I was looking through Rose's dictionary one time, and I noticed she had X's and lines and just scratched out the word divorce out of her dictionary. And I made a comment on it. She kind of laughed and says, look over the M's. And I looked over, she had a circle and a star around murder. I got the message. Part of the reason why I've never stepped out on her is I've been too scared to death. No, I shouldn't say that. I've never even been tempted. I've done a lot of things wrong in my life, done a lot of things wrong in the marriage, but that's not one of them. When Paul says it's better to marry than to burn, he's talking about don't have a sexual partner as a plaything, because you're going to end up burning. God determined it was one man for one woman, one lifetime. He said it in the Garden of Eden when he brought Eve to Adam. Jesus reiterated it when they wanted him to discuss the idea of divorce. And, Jesus says something interesting. He says from the beginning, divorce wasn't so, but because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed it. But then Paul quotes the same thing God said in the Garden of Eden, therefore shall a man rise up, leave father and mother, and cleave unto their wife, and they shall be one. Jesus says that when they came to question about divorce. Paul put some light on that in Ephesians 5. He says, therefore shall a man leave father and mother and cleave unto the wife, and the two shall become one. This is a hard statement. Now, why is that hard, Paul? Because I'm speaking of Christ and the church. You know what marriage is really for? Most people tell me, well, that's to populate the earth. No, we've done a good job at that. But according to the Apostle Paul in Ephesians 5, marriage is to teach us the relationship between Christ as the husband of the church. That's what marriage is all about. That's why you can't have more than one spouse. Go ahead, hon. Can you lower your mask a little bit? My ears are as old as my birth certificate.
church or generally? Because I've been told that it's in reference to Christians and the church.
Well, I think the best answer I can give you on that, and we might have to discuss a little further, is it's talking about both.
Because I've heard Church of Christ ministers say that if you were married and divorced before you became a Christian, that doesn't count. It only counts after you become baptized and become a member of the church.
Well, I'd have to tell you, I'm not one of those preachers. And here's why. If the marriage is wrong before baptism, it's still wrong. Baptism doesn't take a sin that I'm committing and make it okay for me to commit that sin. Now, I don't go as far as some. I'm not going to refuse to baptize a guy because he says, well, I'm on my second wife. Because the Bible never tells him exactly what to do about that. It does command him to be baptized. It does command me to baptize him. But I would recommend him never to marry again if he gets divorced. Stay celibate, because then I know I'm right. But I'm not going to go on record and say, well, God says this, but I think this is okay. I mean, it's kind of like during the COVID thing when all these congregations were shutting down. God says not to forsake the assembly. I'm going to be in an assembly. And if Tonto was shut down, I'd have moved everything of roses out of the garage, and I've been meeting with a little group in the garage. All right? Because God said to do it. Now, God didn't say not to forsake the assembly of ourselves together unless some extenuating circumstance comes up. Now, there may be things, if the building burns down on Saturday night, we're obviously not going to be able to meet here. But we can still gather somewhere, even in the park down there. All right? So to get back to the heart of your question, when he talks about marriage, I think there's a part that he is definitely in the scriptures talking about the physical world. But I also think he's largely talking about the relationship between me and Christ. And I think it's both. And you'll find that with a lot of prophecies, you'll find double fulfillments. One of the famous ones you're going to start hearing a lot next couple of weeks is, and a virgin shall be with child. All right. Now, if you look at Isaiah 7:14, this is going to be a sign to Ahab. Now, Ahab had been dead how many hundreds of years before Christ was born? So how could Christ being born be a sign unto Ahab? Well, you go back and dig it out. Do you know that Hebrew word that's translated most often virgin could also be young woman? And Isaiah had a young wife. And guess who had a child? And if you dig into the Hebrew word, what he called him, it comes out the same as the Greek word that we translate Emmanuel. So there was the sign to Ahab. But Matthew comes back and tells us, in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 23, that the birth of Christ fulfilled this. And my answer is you got two fulfillments in a lot of prophecies. And we need to recognize that. Now, when Jeremiah prophesied